here's what I'll tell you. We have a draft prospect this year who I've been working with since he was in high school. He's at a major university, basically pitched at 93 to 95 miles per hour this year for the most part as a relief pitcher. He would close for this Division I program. The season wrapped up obviously because of COVID. He only had, I think, 3 appearances on the year. And he basically, because that happened, the season ends and he's allowed to do his own thing now, right? So he's doing his own lifting, and we were able to get him on a good aggressive throwing program. He sent me a video of his bullpen from the other day. He hit 99 twice, right? And what was the difference? Yes, it was training. Yes, it was a new throwing program, all that. That's a big jump. That's an elite velocity that became ultra elite, top 1% of professional baseball players. And what it really comes down to, they stopped running him into the ground. He was doing that in and out, it was just beating his body down. So he was able to display the fitness that he probably already had. So, for me, work capacity is a very specific discussion.
That was Eric Cressey, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by our longtime sponsor, Simply Faster. There are a lot of sports technology companies out there, but Simply Faster is the only website you can go to that features an online store that covers the bandwidth of training technology, from force plates to timing systems to muscle simulators and more. Some products of Simply Faster that I use and love include things like the Freelap timing system in K-Box, or coaches' favorites such as GymAware. Recently, Simply Faster has added 2 units that as a coach you should definitely take a look at. The first is the Muscle Lab Contact Grid, which is an extremely affordable and portable, step-by-step, literally, system to collect data on jumps, bounds, sprints, agility, hurdle hops, and really as much as your creative mind can imagine. In what used to take a whole runway worth of data collecting strips, the Contact Grid does it all with only 2 small strips that together cover up to 40 meters of sprinting. Ground contact time, step rates, rhythms, and beyond are at your fingertips with this device. Another new unit, the VO2 Master, is an ultra-portable gas exchange analyzer. Don't guess on energy system development when you can get direct insight into VO2 capabilities in relation to specific sports skills, rather than being hooked up to tubes on a treadmill, or worse yet, a cycle ergometer to get a VO2 max. Think of the VO2 Master as your own gas exchange lab without the tubes and wires. Deepen your analysis in the specific conditioning preparation of your athletes with the VO2 Master today. These products and incredible customer service make Simply Faster your go-to for your sports technology needs. I'm happy to have partnered with them in sponsoring this podcast. Their support has been tremendous, so check them out today at simplyfaster.com. That's simply with an I, faster.com. Hello and welcome to another episode. Glad to have you guys here today. My coaching journey has been a really diverse one. One that started where it was very purely interested in sprinting and jumping, and I guess you could say a little bit more lower extremity oriented activities. I was a track and field sprints and jumps coach for very much of my work for years. And although I did do strength and conditioning for sports like basketball and football, I can't say that I was really well-rounded because I hadn't really worked with overhead athletes, true overhead athletes much. Fast forward a couple of years, me now working as a full-time university strength and conditioning coach, I work with swimming and tennis a lot. I really had to expand my knowledge of the human body and get into the workings of the shoulder. And one of the people who has been a big educational force in that regard has been Eric Cressey. Not only in terms of the shoulder, really, but I've read Eric's work back on T Nation. Now, this being T Nation when it did have a little bit more focus on athleticism and human function in the mid 2000s or 00s, but I've been reading Eric's work for a long time. For those of you who aren't familiar with Eric's current work, he is the president and co-founder of Cressey Sports Performance, which is a preeminent baseball performance training institution with facilities in Hudson, Massachusetts, and Jupiter, Florida. Cressey Sports Performance in the past 5 years has worked with 125 athletes that have been selected in the MLB draft, and they work with players from all MLB organizations. In addition to Cressey Performance, Eric also works with the New York Yankees as the Director of Player Health and Performance. And Eric is, again, as I said, a huge force in the world of coaching education, and particularly in working with overhead athletes. For the show today, I wanted to get into Eric's journey. I wanted to get into how he has grown and evolved as a coach on a few levels, one of which was skill-specific work. And I came across, I think it was within the past year, maybe a couple of years ago, but Eric getting into some of the skill biomechanics of pitchers. And to me, I'm always interested in the evolution of the field and where strength and conditioning or whatever the term for the profession is exactly, where it's going in terms of blending with sports skills themselves. So Eric is going to get into his experience with that and working with athletes beyond the context of just general strength. He's also going to get into his evolution of training the shoulder. As I mentioned, Eric has been a big resource for me in shoulder health and training. And so it was really cool to ask him what's changed throughout the years and how he looks at not only the shoulder, but also just training overhead athletes in general. So Eric's going to give us a lot of information on that, some training implications and resources. And then he's also going to get into his take in work capacity on baseball players, specificity of work capacity, and more. This was a really information-dense episode, and it was really awesome to sit down and talk with someone as accomplished and professional as Eric. Whether you're a baseball strength coach or work with baseball, overhead athletes, or not, there's a ton to be gained from this episode, and I think you guys are really going to like this one. So let's get on to it. Episode 203 with Eric Cressey. Eric, good to have you on the show, man. I'd love to get the first question I had is, what initially got you into training baseball? I know it's what you're so well known for. Was it your primary sport, or was it something that happened just by happenstance? How did you get into baseball?
No, it's funny. I actually only played baseball until 8th grade. I was a much better tennis player, and they coincided in terms of the sports calendar in the Northeast where I grew up. So I played soccer and tennis growing up, and eventually got into powerlifting. I joke I took up powerlifting to convince people that I was actually tough. And baseball actually kind of happened by accident. I did get my graduate degree at the University of Connecticut. While I was there, we worked a lot with basketball and soccer. In fact, while I was there, our men's and women's basketball and men's and women's soccer teams were all at one point number one in the country. So I had always assumed, basketball being kind of like my biggest interest from 2003 to 2005, that I would go that route, and certainly looked at some jobs in college basketball after I finished my grad degree. But when I'm going to the private sector, and it just so happened that some of the first athletes that I started working with were baseball players. It was right when I moved to Boston in 2006, and really started up with 4 of those guys, all from the same high school. And it was interesting, just, took a liking to it. I had a bunch of shoulder problems with my tennis career, and there's a similar injury mechanism. So I took a great interest in it and realized that this was a pretty underserved population, where, I joke that, they're kind of, the pendulum always swings too far in one direction, right? Either they give them the football program and expect everybody just to squat, bench, and clean. And then there's also the other end of the spectrum where it's like, hey, baseball players don't need to lift weights. Just do some bands for rotator cuffs and some forearm work and you're good to go. We figured out that, you could train people in a happy medium there and push them really hard if you were cognizant of the demands of the sport and functional challenges that, they had to overcome, the structural changes that may take place. So it just so happened those 4 guys, they won the Division I state championship in Massachusetts in 2007. One of them went 12-0 on the mound and was state player of the year. Basically all 4 of them went Division I, and my phone started ringing off the hook. So an article ran in the Boston Globe on May 20th, 2007. I remember because it was my birthday. And so sure enough, my phone started ringing off the hook, and that led to us opening a facility. And, early on we catered to everybody. We didn't want to be known as a specific gym for baseball players, but after it grew and grew and grew in that niche, we realized, hey, this is something that's sustainable, that we can really get good at. We can train our staff in it, and it's a differentiating factor. So we kind of created the market in that regard. Now there are, a lot more baseball specific strength and conditioning facilities and all that, but it happened very kind of organically, almost by accident, just from something I fell into and took a big interest in.
It's funny you mentioned that you were a tennis player that got into powerlifting. Like, how often does that happen? Like, well, I work with tennis, and it's not, maybe some of them I think joke about being bodybuilders after, but it's not like, that's not super serious on their end. So that's an interesting transition in and of itself.
I think it's every tennis player's dream. I always joke, like, every time we've had a baseball player retire, all of them, like, they just can't wait to like go in and bench press like the first day after they retire. Like, in fact, we had a guy retired last year who came in and he did double sessions. He benched in the morning, and he was like, I like that so much. He came back and benched that night. I'm like, all right, your career's over. Go have some fun. You get a day.
Yeah, that's what my tennis players will primarily do if it's like dead week or finals week, and I'm not allowed to coach them for any voluntary workouts, and they get to do whatever they want. Usually, you'll see them sneaking in some barbell bench press, straight bar bench, and all that stuff. The stuff that they don't get to do or don't get to do very much in typical training. So, I definitely get that. One thing that I'd seen in your work, Eric, that I'm really curious about is, my frame of reference, right? It's T-Nation 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, as I think a lot of people listening. And then recently, in looking at some of your Instagram, you'll see you laying out pitch mechanics and really getting into the pitch mechanics side of things. And I think that's such a huge, if you had to lay out a spectrum between T-Nation and getting into kinetics and kinematics of pitching, what a difference, right? And so can you tell us a little bit about your journey and getting into more of the technical side as you've gotten further in this?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I want to say it was the off season of 08, 09. Best example I can give you is we had a guy named Sean Haviland. Sean was 33rd round pick by the A's out of Harvard. He was Ivy League pitcher of the year. He was a 5'11" righty who threw 88 to 90 miles an hour. And for those of you who aren't super familiar with baseball, those players don't stick around in professional baseball that long. I think he was a senior sign for $1,000 or whatever, but he loved the game and wanted to play as long as he could. And we kind of had that conversation. It's like, hey, you're not going to be around long unless you're a different pitcher when you go back. And so, we sold out for the dream. I was like, hey, are you willing to be a little bit of a guinea pig for this stuff and try some different things and all that? He was like, yeah, for sure. Use me. And he was a guy who changed his strength conditioning around. He threw the med ball more than he ever had. He ate better. But I basically just, threw some poop on the wall to see what stuck in terms of a throwing program. So I wrote up a weighted ball and extreme long toss program, really pushed him hard. And I'll never forget, I got a text probably January 20th or so. He had gone back and thrown live against the hitters at Harvard before he reported spring training. He's like, I was 91 to 94 today. You're pretty good at what you do. And I'm like, I'm still not really sure what I'm doing. But he had this, this life-changing velocity jump, and sure enough, we started seeing some 95s, 96s, and he's an all-star a couple years in a row. And yeah, it's funny, he actually just retired recently. He's working in the Red Sox front office now. But Sean was a guy who we learned together. I remember those conversations, like, what do you think of this? And we gradually tested the waters of the volume we wanted to use in terms of our throwing programs and all that. And, so that was kind of the first foray into like, hey, a strength and conditioning coach is writing a throwing program. That never happened. Either it was the pitching coaches that did it, or it was like a rehab throwing program that came from the PTs or the surgeon or anything like that. But there wasn't a whole lot going on from a performance standpoint. Really the only guy back then that was doing it was Derek Johnson, who was at Vanderbilt. He's now the pitching coach of the Cincinnati Reds. But these were things that were around for a long time. You can go back and look at Soviet track and field throwers, and weighted implements have been around for a long time. They hadn't really been heavily utilized. And what I started to look at is, these have a place on the force velocity continuum. We're lifting heavy stuff, we're running fast, we're jumping high with just body weight, and we're throwing a 5-ounce ball. But there's all these areas in the middle that we have to take advantage of. And it just, got me to start thinking a lot more about weighted balls, medicine balls, things like that. And we pushed hard in those middle of the road. And looking back, we had a lot of guys that probably had college strength conditioning experiences where they got a lot stronger, but it didn't necessarily, give them great carryover. And training in those middle grounds, seemed to have a lot of value. So that's been refined over the years. But the next step was logically, we just started to do our thing. We realized, hey, there are things that are being coached mechanically that, they're well-intentioned, but they don't take into account the limitations an athlete has. Like sometimes he just can't get himself into the positions he need. And I think the really important thing to appreciate is like, we still don't know what good pitching mechanics are. Everyone in the world will tell you they know. It's actually the most heavily debated topic out there. And the research is actually shockingly inconclusive. They've looked at inverted W, they've looked at the Tommy John twist, they've looked at all these different patterns that we thought were, horrifically bad for the arm. And when you actually look at the stressors on them, like they're really not as significant as we thought, right? And not only that, we always thought like mound stress was the highest. Turns out mound stress is probably higher for the shoulder and lower for the elbow. So we're kind of like picking our poison to some degree. So there's all these things that we didn't understand. But one of the things I kept coming back to is we might all disagree on what is good mechanics, but I think we all agree like what a good lunge looks like, right? What a good push-up looks like, there's a lot of competencies that, we can all fundamentally agree on. And so what I came back to was like, hey, we should pick this low hanging fruit. Teaching people to move well, we're never going to have pushback on that, because ultimately, there's a great research from Stu McGill. He did it in conjunction with Exos down in Pensacola, Florida, where they looked at firefighters, and it's a study of firefighters. What does it mean for baseball players? Well, I actually talk about this a lot. It's a study I think everybody should understand. And what they did was they took a collection of firefighters. One group basically was handed an exercise program, said go do this, and another group was given basically a program where they were actually coached through exercises. They had, supervision. They were educated on proper movements, things like that. What they did was they pre-tested them on a collection of firefighter specific tasks, and they looked at joint loading. And then they retested these folks at the end of basically that. It was a 12-week intervention. And what was interesting is both groups improved in terms of body composition, VO2 max, all these things that you wanted to make sure were good outcome measures. But what was really intriguing was that only the group that had been coached actually reduced joint loads in certain places. They learned to move more efficiently. So it was important to appreciate, because these firefighters had not practiced these tasks. Instead, they had trained in a more general sense. And sure enough, all those benefits have been conferred onto a more specific action. So I come back to, if you move well in a weight room, it's going to increase the likelihood that you're going to move well as a pitcher in the box or anything like that. So, I just come back to, you have to understand what your athletes are doing, whether you're a tennis coach, whether you're a strength and conditioning coach for baseball or hockey or whatever it is. Like, there are unique structural adaptations that take place because of the demands of those actions. And it's our job to make sure people don't reach a symptomatic threshold or develop structural pathology in light of them. So you always work backwards from what good movement really is.
Yeah. When you were talking about the program for the baseball player, that first pitcher that you had worked with, it really made me think about the idea that I think in so many cases you need to almost get somewhere outside the field to continue to improve, in the sense that I would imagine that a lot of that, who knows adaptation and forces better than a strength coach, right? And like you said, there's no perfect technique. And in my world, or one of the things I look at is jumping, and jumping off two legs especially. There's lots of different techniques. There's no, to think that you could coach someone, if you spend all your time coaching someone into a quote unquote perfect technique that doesn't exist, how much better are they going to get versus exposing them to a new problem to solve, new forces to output, and new ways to do that. And it seems like, I don't know, it's just, to me, it's interesting. How have you, I mean, do you work with mechanics I mean, I shouldn't say mechanics, but like, do you work now, this is what I'm trying to ask, is your work now a lot more than working with people on like velocity in a more specific manner? Yeah.
It's on a huge different level. So what I would say is, if you walk in our facilities, we have pitching coordinators at both facilities. We have associate pitching coordinators at both facilities. So it's not even just what we're coaching in terms of the mechanics of movements or, throwing programs like that. We're actually digging much, much deeper. Where baseball is, they've had a surge in data collection and usage over many years. And certainly, my work in professional baseball, I get access to all this on a crazy level. But, you can look directly at how, physical competencies relate to mechanical proficiencies that impact how you impart force to the baseball, right? So if you see guys that are throwing accidental cutters, it's not just something that you see in terms of, all right, you're winding up with undersided elbow pain, but you're also looking at, it's a fastball with poor spin efficiency. So, we look at things, from a pitching standpoint. You could look at spin efficiency, spin rate, spin axis. You can look at extension. You can look at vertical and horizontal release height. You can look at vertical attack angle. There's so many different things that we can dig in really deeply on it. So I would actually argue, like, we don't just have mechanics coaches. We have a mini analytics department at both facilities, and we can really like dig deeply on a lot of these things and do some special stuff. But it's so powerful when you can start to teach people how the movement that they have, or the ones that they can't get to, impact how they're able to perform on the mound. And baseball, from a data collection standpoint, is one of the really, really good ones. I think in other sports, we see it more from a sports science standpoint, right? You look at GPS and, people trying to track how many steps a basketball player is taking, how many miles a soccer midfielder is covering over the course of a game, and how you look at optimizing recovery and load management, things like that. And in baseball, we actually use our data even more for skill development. And that's a really powerful thing. I'm not sure that you're getting that, on a crazy level, outside of maybe golf and any other sport.
Yeah, I imagine the field now too, especially in the private sector, where I think there's probably less potential silos. I would imagine the field's really evolving that way. If you want to keep up and stay competitive, you have to have more of an intimate understanding of the sport skill itself, and you can't just be a general strength facility.
Yeah, and I think that's a Pandora's box, so to speak. I think there are more and more people that can get access to a lot of the data. They don't understand necessarily what creates it. So it's one thing just to have a lot of information. It's nothing altogether to actually use it to impart some kind of change on an athlete for favorable benefits. So I think that's one of the challenges that we're dealing now is there's, the industry is getting a little bit more diluted. And that's true of everything, right? We've seen that with just about every discipline out there, whether it's, functional range conditioning or Z Health or Posture Restoration Institute or DNS or anything, right? There are good and bad practitioners under every single discipline. People who have dug really, really deep into methodology and others that just barely start to grasp it, just enough to be dangerous. I think the same can honestly be said of a lot of the stuff that's happening right now in baseball and data collection and how they're coaching people with throwing programs and mechanics stuff. So, it's like anything else. There's perks and there's drawbacks to it.
Yeah, it's interesting with baseball and that sport in particular. I know they all are a little bit, but baseball, especially with the data-driven element. You mentioned something at the weight room and the general competencies, and I had a couple of weight room questions for you.
Yeah.
The first one is how has getting into the specifics of pitching and mechanics and the positions needed to hit, has that been like a big change on your weight room program in that time period following, or at least has that had an impact on what you're looking for athletes to be able to do in the weight room?
Yeah, absolutely. I think ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to prepare our athletes, not just for the specifics of our sport, right? Whether that's pitching or hitting, but we also want to prepare them for, a chaotic world, right? The lack of predictability. Like we don't know what's going to happen when you run to first base, right? You might have to do a head first slide to come in under a tag. You might have to, sidestep a first baseman who's coming up the line. You might have to do a lot of different things. So I think we want to always prepare our athletes for an element of chaos. So, historically speaking, what happens in the weight room, we get a lot of sagittal plane dominant, bilateral exercises, things like that. And, certainly my background was in powerlifting, so when that's your background, you have to emotionally separate yourself from, all that stuff that's been fun for you or has been, top of mind awareness for you. We realize that rotational athletes are different beasts, right? We can look at the spines of NFL linemen and compare them to spines of, elite golfers and baseball players. And, one is, very, very, bendy and great for rotational stuff. And the other one is really just kind of like locked into handle compression. These are markedly different things. So, when that kind of goes down, you definitely start to change your approach. There's certainly a point where you get strong enough. You need to train other competencies. You need to train a lot more rotationally. We look at, just the core positioning that's needed to effectively transfer force and then, rotational patterns. We look at the need for scapular upward rotation. There's so many different things. So yeah, it's definitely forced me to change a lot of what I do. And, to be honest, like I think there's so many, coaches out there who hang their hat on, this is how much our guys squat, and this is how much of our guys deadlift. And don't get me wrong, like peak power is important for sports, but if you walked into a Major League Baseball room, like in a locker room, and watched a lot of guys walking around with their shirt off, you'd be sorely disappointed, right? If you go out and you time their 60 time, or, look at what their, best squat is or something like that, you're going to be probably pretty surprised. Like these guys are successful for a variety of different reasons. A lot of times their traits and their characteristics. So it's up to us to figure out what we need to optimize, and above all, it's how do we make them move efficiently so they can do it over, 162 games.
Yeah, I like what you said about emotionally distancing yourself from your own background. I think it's really easy. Even me, not having a powerlifting background, but a jump training and plyometric background, and wanting to. Plyometrics are good, but there always comes a point where a certain intensity is not conducive. I'm curious, how has your thoughts on like max effort lifting and strength and the implements that you use changed over time in your journey from powerlifting just getting started to working with pro baseball over the years?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are principles of building strength that are common across, multiple disciplines. Like, yeah, we're not taking a lot of 1RM attempts and things like that, but, things like heavy triples and stuff like that can be great. I'd say in terms of implements, we use safety squat bars a ton. We've got giant camber bars. We've got the spider bar. Transformer bar is a kind of safety squat bar. So, we lose a lot of those implements. So those have been, kind of carryovers, bands, chains, stuff like that we've utilized from the powerlifting world. Even though, I wouldn't necessarily call them powerlifting exercises. They're everybody exercises. But, I think that journey that I took opened my eyes to some different ways that, we can train people. But I come back to it. It's not hard to get people strong. Create a good environment, coach technique, and be patient. Athletes get strong. The question becomes is how strong is strong enough? And are we chasing strength to the exclusion of other qualities, right? You and I both know that if you got an athlete with a 550 deadlift, the amount of work it takes to get to a 600 deadlift, that might be a year and a half of training. In that year and a half, what other things could you work on? Could you train much more rate of force development? Could you work on elasticity? Can you optimize mobility a little bit more? There's all these different ways that you can make people better. Is it worth devoting all of your recovery resources just to that?
Yeah, no doubt. And it's interesting to hear, like some of the variations that you've used over time and how just like, I guess, the distinctions between some of the typical powerlifting movements. Are there any of those movements that you still do use, or if a player has a real strong preference towards something? I mean, is like a typical powerlifting movement?
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, our guys will still use squat and deadlift variations. I mean, I'd say the overwhelming majority of our guys deadlift in some capacity, unless we have someone who's in extreme scapular depression or someone just doesn't handle bilateral loading well. We tend to use a lot more probably trap bar than we do straight bar. But we have athletes that squat. My guess is that probably 50% of our pro athletes squat, a lot more like axial loaded single leg stuff. We'll do a little bit of box squatting here and there to give guys some variety, maybe cycle it in for a month and then take it out. But, we're not benching any of our guys. In fact, we don't really even do much dumbbell bench pressing, maybe a little bit here and there. It's a lot more like what we call free scapula pressing, landmines, cables, push-up variations, things like that.
Yeah, I was the kind of in the tail of the what do athletes do, knowing like the mechanics, knowing the positions these athletes get in and throwing and things like that. Yeah. Is there any things that you mentioned lunges? I mean, is there anything like along those lines? It's like you really need to be able to do this movement pretty well in the weight room to be robust. Yeah,
I certainly think there's a place for, an adequate amount of single leg stability. Like, it's a big red flag for me if if an athlete can't do like a reverse lunge with a front squat grip with 185 pounds or more, like that tells me that, you need a lot more single leg proficiency. Like I think, all of our pro guys should be able to deadlift 405 and, for reps, on a trap bar. Like that's not hard to accomplish. I'll tell you this, like one of the things I find myself doing more than ever, and it's, in part because there's, guys like Nick Winkleman and other great coaches out there who are putting out really good stuff on, the words we use and how we coach. But, I find myself creating context with respect to the baseball world. Like if we have a guy doing a split stance cable press, I'll just be like, think glove side fastball, right? What do you have to do to throw a glove side fastball? Your scap needs to get around your rib cage. You got to get, front hip pullback, and it just changes the way that conceptually they move. And it's not perfectly, specific to that pattern, right? There may not be as much layback, whatever it is, but, those are things that I try to use a lot more now.
You're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast, brought to you by Simply Faster. Yeah, I love that idea of drawing context in throughout especially it's probably more of the auxiliary movements. I think the big lifts, it's probably a little harder to draw specific context, but yeah, all the other things in your program and being able to do that, especially in a specific population, I definitely, I can see like that creation of positive and associative feedback loops and how that is a big thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
One question, Eric, that I'm excited to ask you, because I have, I don't remember how many years ago I got it, but I got an old, it was not a DVD set, but a DVD of several lectures in training the shoulder. And for a guy who's been in that game for such a long time, so familiar with the anatomy, everything that goes into it, all the systems, what are some ways that your view on training and keeping the shoulder injury free has evolved over time?
Yeah, I think early on, your influence is always, to some degree, the physical therapy world. And I think one of the things that we see in the PT world is you have to think about what the majority of their patients are, outside of a really athletic population. Most of the time they're seeing, grandma rotator cuff repairs, things like that. And what you're going to do for a 65-year-old man who's been sitting at a computer for an entire career after his shoulder surgery is actually a lot different than what you need to do for, a lot of your your athletes that are in extension rotation sports. So, I think one of the things that we saw early on, and, I was guilty of it early in my career, is you thought just down and back, get the lats strong, basically get the scapula locked in place. And you realize that all these guys to throw a baseball to preserve that good ball and socket congruency, the scapula needs to upwardly rotate. So, cueing a lot more stuff where you're actually differentiating between just aggressive scapular retraction or depression versus the posterior tilt you want to get from lower traps and serratus. I think that was a game changer. Certainly like looking at the concepts that Sarman puts forth in terms of movement impairment syndromes at the upper extremity, looking at scapular depression and downward rotation and how it impacts some of our other training. So I was lucky to have a great mentor, Eric Schoenberg, who's our physical therapist here in Florida, who trained under Sarman, and he's really helped me a lot in that regard. The concepts of free scapula pressing, like we're in a sport where your shoulder blade has to move, in open space. You can't just pin it down on a bench and expect it to magically carry over. That was a big one. I think on a lot of our rotator cuff stuff, right? We would do a bunch of cable and band and sideline dumbbell stuff, and you realize that when you do a lot of stuff with your elbow at your side, you're not actually training it in the functional positions. You want to be strong in the positions that really matter. So, we've spent a lot more time up at 90 degrees, training not just cuff strength, but also cuff timing, rhythmic stabilizations, end range holds, being strong in that laid back position that really matters. All of those are really, really big, emphasizing upward rotation, getting serratus going, even beyond that, I would just say I'm fortunate. My business partner, Shane, in Florida is one of the best manual therapists I've ever seen. He's incredible. And Shane's worked, if there's a Major League Baseball player that you've seen pitch on TV, Shane's probably worked on him. He's worked on Serena Williams, just incredible, knowledge, not just of anatomy, but of feel. And some people can just feel tissues when they're right, they're wrong. So I think Shane's gotten us looking a lot more at the fascial system, where he'll treat a left hip and a right shoulder will feel better right afterwards. So looking at a lot more of the fascial lines and how it impacts the movement we have. And I think that's just made us better and better. So once you understand how a specific joint should move, getting it more integrated into longer patterns that have a lot of carryover to what we really do. So it's a million different things for sure.
Yeah, and I'm sure that question really could be a whole podcast or series of episodes too, really digging into each one of those little points. I know, I don't remember how many years ago I had read it, but it was Mike Robertson's article on a Teenage of all places, but going back to read, it was on upward rotation of the scap and how important that was for balance. And I think we so often think balance is just in the bench press plane or something. And
that's another thing I would say that I've changed. It's, we've always been taught balance your pushes and your pulls. To be honest, when a lot of people do more vertical pushes, they often feel better because it drives freedom of motion of the scapula. When you do good, landmine presses or even overhead presses, stuff like that, my shoulder doesn't handle traditional, military pressing well. But if I get on a landmine press, I can sell out for the dream and it feels great. It actually feels a lot better. Whereas, you get people that get really lat dominant. They do a lot of vertical pulling. It gives them more problems. So I would actually argue we should be looking at free versus fixed scapula pressing, how much vertical versus horizontal pushing and pulling. Everyone needs something a little bit different. So the concept of 2 pulls for every push, maybe it works great for, Joe Smith who sits at a desk all day, but it's not going to be right for everybody else.
Yeah. I found it interesting how you talked about the lats, when you just started, right? That being, and that kind of probably fitting with the push, the typical push pull and balancing things out. But that being, it's really interesting how that's all changed. Cause when the lats are overpowering and they get tight and extension patterns and everything that goes with that, it's really interesting. I was going to ask you a little bit about too, and this hit home for me as well, cause it was about the time I had read Mike's article and there was this light bulb moment where I'm looking at some of my tennis players. We were doing just barbell overhead press, but the guys who had shoulder issues were so painfully weak at that movement. I could barely believe it. And it was at that point, I'm okay, this needs to become a bigger thing in my program. But you had mentioned too, the differences between your shoulders aren't meant for that movement, but the landmine allows you to, do really well at it. And you mentioned, I think, scapular free versus fixed pressing. Could you go into that a little bit? And then I have another overhead weight room question for you.
Yeah, for sure. So, when we talk about anything that allows your shoulder blade to move, so that would be a landmine press, a cable press, where there's nothing that's holding it back. For me, that's a free scapular pressing. Obviously, push-ups are a great example. I think the fixed stuff would be more of like your bench press, your floor press. Everybody thinks floor presses are healthier because you don't go down as far, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, I really don't like floor presses because your shoulder blades are still just stuck against the floor. Like, I like freedom of motion. And, this isn't new. Like Al Vermeil talked about this many, many years ago. They did a lot more upright stuff, things like that. So, that for me, that's a very important discussion that we have to have is, what's allowing the scap to move freely. But I think, to your other point about like the overhead aspect of it, like we have to also appreciate the vector of the resistance, right? So if you're doing a barbell military press or even a dumbbell press to a lesser degree, the load is coming directly down from gravity. When you look at a landmine press, there is absolutely an angle to it, right? And you can even kind of appreciate this. I encourage everybody to try it out. It does feel markedly different. It's what in many cases why you can use more loading on a landmine press and all that. So I think we have to appreciate that sometimes going directly to an overhead press, even though some of these people may need some free scapular pressing, that might be like calculus when they haven't even done algebra. Like it's putting them in like the absolute most vulnerable position. And I'd argue for most of those individuals too, like whether it's a tennis player or baseball player, a lot of them have an element of structural pathology in there that, they may stink overhead because they've actually got an undersurface cuff, tear that makes it harder for them to get there. So I'd rather give them a chance to be successful in a safe environment, and you can still develop a great training effect from it. Like how often are you arms directly overhead under load in athletics? It doesn't happen often, but in many cases you have to brace against an external resistance like you would on a landmine press or something like that. So to me, it actually is much more functional.
Yeah, that's where those shoulder presses definitely transformed into landmine presses over the subsequent years after just figuring some things out. It definitely resonates So is there a place where, how often are you letting players, I'm sure it totally depends on the player too, do work, or what is the place for fixed scapular work then within training? It's obviously not the optimal thing, but is there still a place for that? Do you still let people do it?
Yeah, certainly like in any scenario where you need to put some muscle mass on somebody, right? Like, you can obviously move more weight when you're locked into place like that. So, by all means, if you're a football player, like have at it. Don't be shy. Like it doesn't really matter for soccer players and things like that. But, if you want to get people, stronger, like that's absolutely an inclusion. And I'm not saying you got to exclude it for everybody, but my world is overhead athletes. Nobody cares how much they bench. It's literally an inconsequential thing. They care how hard they throw and how big their bank account is. So, like that, those are the mindsets you have to have with coaching is you have to separate yourself from the things you really enjoy.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of just watching how an athlete moves in the gym or even in a weight room setting, and you're watching their shoulder and you're watching how they go throughout their presses and things like that. Is there any things that tend to indicate that an athlete's in trouble? Like if they don't clear some things up, they could be in for a shoulder injury?
Yeah, what I tend to watch out a lot for is like, and it's hard to describe in an online context, but I look at where the movement comes from. Certainly watching out for any kind of like heavy lumbar extension anytime people go overhead. Like that's a pretty good sign they're not in a great place. That would be a lot of arching of the low back, the ribs flare up. I'll watch for how well the scapula upwardly rotates. Can I see that inferior medial border? Does it get around like the inside middle border of the scapula? Does it get towards the armpit or does it kind of stay stuck down? But you'll often see what I would call like the robbing Peter to pay Paul. So you'll often see like a scenario where the glenohumeral joints and the ball and socket, the ball will ride up on the socket excessively because the socket doesn't move on the rib cage enough. So we'll often see people that get a lot of arm motion because the scapula isn't moving enough. So those are things that you just need to get out ahead of.
Eric, you mentioned like looking at baseball players in the locker room in the sense of being in shape, and I think that it was I forget what player it was. It was like in the 60s, back when basketball and baseball, you might play two sports, and it was more of a thing. And there was I forget what his name was, but he said he's like, I have to take a month to get out of shape enough to go play baseball after playing basketball.
I think it was John Kruk that said we're not athletes, we're baseball players or something like that. But I actually just heard a really good podcast with Michael Lewis, who wrote Moneyball, who said that one of the things that compelled him to write the article was that he was in the Oakland A's like locker room and he saw these underwhelming physiques over and over again. He's like, I have to talk about why these people are professional athletes, what makes them good. So that part was intriguing. It's not the norm. Don't get me wrong. Like we have these people are much more athletic than I am. Like you forget about it. Like these are the best of the best, and in a sport, and they're the top 0.0001% that actually make it and get paid well to do it. But it is an intriguing discussion.
Yeah, that idea it led me to the last question I had for your last topic, and that's your take on work capacity in athletes, especially baseball, right? Like athletes who it's not a heart rate sport, but it's a sport of repetition. And how do you go about the topic of work capacity? And I'm sure baseball too, there's all the old school, the running mentality and everything that goes with that, of course, that we know is outdated. But what's your take in that area and building that in baseball players?
Yeah, the first thing is I would tell you is I'm a big believer, and the research certainly backs this up. Work capacity is incredibly skill specific, right? So just because I have great work capacity as a lifter and I can handle lots of singles over 90% and not get burned out, doesn't mean that I'm going to be a great rower, right? Lance Armstrong was the best cyclist on the planet and became like an average marathoner, right? Within a year. So clearly those things don't magically carry over. So just because I can thrash somebody on a Versa climber or a rower or whatever it is, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to carry over what happens on a baseball field, right? With that said, I do think there is a very important need for a strong aerobic base, right? Because that allows us to bounce back between pitches, between sets, between training sessions. The majority of our life is spent in an aerobic world, and I think for most athletes, like if you get a resting heart rate under 60, you're probably in a pretty good spot. We also know the aerobic base is pretty easy to maintain, outside of really elite populations. Like if you just need to be good enough, by all means, train it. Here's what I'll tell you. We have a draft prospect this year who I've been working with since he was in high school. He's at a major university, basically pitched at 93 to 95 miles per hour this year for the most part as a relief pitcher. He would close for this Division I program. The season wrapped up obviously because of COVID. He only had, I think, 3 appearances on the year. And he basically, because that happened, the season ends and he's allowed to do his own thing now, right? So he's doing his own lifting, and we were able to get him on a good aggressive throwing program. He sent me a video of his bullpen the other day. He hit 99 twice, right? And what was the difference? Yes, it was training. Yes, it was a new throwing program, all that. That's a big jump. Like that's an elite velocity that became ultra elite, like top 1% of professional baseball players. And what it really comes down to, they stopped running him into the ground. Like he was doing that in and out, like it was just beating his body down. So he was able to display the fitness that he probably already had. So, for me, work capacity is a very specific discussion. And, I would actually even argue, like I'm, as a baseball guy, I'm qualified to speak on baseball work capacity. But if you gave me an MMA guy or you gave me somebody in a different sport, it's going to be markedly different. So what your tennis players need are going to be totally different than what the baseball guys do. So, I think you always have to take that very specific approach. As a general thumb in my world, and this is a really gross simplification, train high or train low, right? I'm not talking about elevation or anything like that. I'm talking about like either stay at a lower intensity and build the aerobic base. And that's like the most boringly slow cardio it is. I like to do some mobility circuits, or go and train intensely. Be 90% plus in terms of your sprint work, throw the crap out of the med ball, run fast, jump high, all that stuff, lift heavy things. Just don't spend your life at 75% of max heart rate. I've seen so many athletes that have interfered with their development just by pushing that long, slow duration cardio.
Yeah, it's hard to believe that the running, using the running as conditioning excessively, still exists so much in baseball. It's crazy, especially
when it's used for punishment. Like if you have to use that for punishment, you recruited the wrong athletes. Let's be honest, or you drafted the wrong athletes. So it's your fault, not theirs.
I like that. You said mobility-based circuits. It reminds me a little bit about like track and field, like working conditioning with sprinters. You don't want to run them for their conditioning because they're sprinters. So people often do just a assortment of body weight exercises and keep the heart rate a certain place. I imagine that's probably pretty similar to what you're doing. Like it's mobility, but it's enough to keep the heart rate up, right? It's probably, what are some elements in there?
Yeah, I think Charlie Francis pioneered a lot of this stuff too with his high-low models, in the past. And, I think the other thing too is like the concept of like microdosing. That's something that gets missed. Like you can train to be fast in limited volumes. Like you can run starts, you can throw the med ball on a regular basis. These are things that aren't crazy stressful. People get wiped out when you push them really, really hard with high volumes of top speed sprinting and stuff like that. So, you can microdose it. But, for us, the majority of our stuff is more mobility circuit based. And I've actually had guys wear heart rate monitors over the years just to kind of see how these things typically fall and, get a little bit of like a sample size of what, guys do in terms of, like their heart rates as they do these circuits. And for the most part, they all, do a pretty good job. You'll get guys actually that go too fast and then the numbers jump up a little bit more on them. But what I love about that is like you're getting other benefits, right? It's not like you're just, basically getting their heart rate up, but you're also going to see changes in the quality of their motion. You're going to see better joint range of motion, more stability in the range of motion they already have. So, we can work on balance. We can do some med ball stuff, different than, obviously our power development stuff, but it just opens a lot more doors for you than that you wouldn't get if you just told them to go for a jog. Yeah,
for sure. Especially with baseball too. And the mobility requirements and and everything that goes with it. I just see that being so beneficial.
It's a high amplitude, low variability movement. If you look at pitching or hitting, right? It's high amplitude because you look at like a guy getting down the mound, he's sacrificing the passive restraints of his lead or his trailing hip because he needs so much hip extension. There's extreme hip shoulder separation. There's tons of internal rotation on the front leg. So it's high amplitude, but you do the same thing over and over again. In fact, if you have variability, like you're less likely to be successful. So we need to give them that variability in their training. We need to accommodate the fact that they need to have a lot of amplitude, but we need to give them some exposures to other things, particularly with how asymmetrical they tend to be too. We can compete against that a little bit when we do good stuff on the side.
Yeah. And I know our time is just about up today. That's another point that I'd love to expand on is the asymmetry, especially a pitcher, right, who's been throwing a particular way. I mean, is that like a big, like someone who is asymmetrical, throws their right arm, I suppose there is at least some need to reverse that. Like you're never going to completely reverse it, but at least addressing it regularly is.
Yeah, I think asymmetry is normal. In many cases, it's what makes them successful. I think what we need to be cognizant of is, does it become excessive, right? What I can tell you is just speaking anecdotally, like, right, obviously like posture restoration is something that's awesome. It's influenced our philosophy a ton, and I encourage people to check it out. I think there's a lot of elements of PRI that allows you to compete against the asymmetry that sports throw at you. You have to remember too, like, right-handed individuals tend to have more extreme asymmetries just from an anatomical standpoint. PRI digs into that deeply, but they also live in a right-handed world and they play right-handed dominant sports and things like that. So they'll re-ingrain it. A lot of your lefties kind of like find ways to work out of it. You know what I mean? Like they're inherently a little bit more biased in a good direction. You get guys who throw lefty and bat righty and vice versa. Like those are, obviously things you have to look at. So I always just try to look at the athlete that's in front of me. And I want, first and foremost, I want to make sure that they have adequate stability in the range of motion that they've already got, right? That's a, core FMS, SFMA concept is, attack those things first and usually get some good downstream effects. So I always try to do that first, but I don't get freaked out by asymmetry just because I've seen some pretty crazy stuff where guys have been healthy. I've seen guys with outrageous scoliosis presentations who have made a bunch of money in the big leagues. So I just try to look at what's in front of me and take a rational approach to it as opposed to generalizing.
Yeah, I love it. I love how you've been able to incorporate and blend so many different schools of thought, the stability and then FMS and PRI and everything that goes with it. So I know our time's limited today and I know you have to get going, Eric, but I really appreciate the talk today and all sharing your knowledge with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed it.
All right, that wraps up another show. I'm signing off. Quickly before we go, a couple things. One, if you enjoyed the show and could leave us a rating or review on iTunes or Stitcher, we would totally appreciate that. Secondly, I just wanted to give another shout out to our sponsor, simplyfaster.com, suppliers of high-end training technology. They have an awesome blog, tons of training pieces, not only for a large gym setting, but also for individuals. So personal timing systems and bar speed monitoring units and muscle stimulators. They really have a diverse store, so be sure to check them out and see what they have to offer. And we will see you guys next week with another great guest. Have a good one.